She was still in the inspection room when the phone rang. Not her phone. She did not have her phone. Her phone was in the gray tray on the counter outside with her diplomatic passport, her credentials wallet, and the briefcase that contained, among other things, a signed communique from the Foreign Ministry of the Republic of Cameroon that had nothing to do with customs and everything to do with why she was in Washington in the first place. The phone that rang was the desk phone in the anteroom adjacent to the inspection room, the extension used for internal TSA communications at Dulles International Airport. It rang at 4:17 p.m., 11 minutes after Amara Owusu-Bempah had been directed into the secondary inspection area by a customs officer named Sandra Greer, who had told her colleagues, loudly enough that two of them heard it, that this was going to be a good one. Sandra picked up the phone. She listened for approximately 4 seconds. Her face changed. The voice on the other end of the line identified itself as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the Republic of Cameroon, located 6.3 miles from where Sandra Greer was standing. The Deputy Chief of Mission said that his embassy had been informed that one of its attaches was being detained at Dulles under circumstances that appeared to be inconsistent with the protections applicable to diplomatic personnel under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. He said he was giving the customs supervisor 2 minutes to produce the attach at the phone before he escalated the matter to the State Department's Office of Protocol. He used the word escalate in the tone of someone for whom escalation is not a threat, but a calendar item. Sandra Greer looked at the inspection room door. She looked at the phone. She had 15 years with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and a record that was, until approximately 23 minutes ago, entirely unremarkable. She was about to understand, in a way that would be thorough and swift and permanent, exactly what it meant to make a joke in the wrong room about the wrong person. Rewind 4 hours. Ambassador Amara Owusu-Bempah, the title was correct, though she wore it with the understated discipline of someone who understands that authority resides in the work, not in the announcement of the work, was 47 years old and had spent 22 years in the specific, demanding, quietly consequential profession of diplomacy. She had grown up in Douala, the daughter of a judge and a university professor of economics, in a household where precision of language was the primary form of respect, where what you said was expected to mean exactly what it said, and where vagueness was understood as a failure of care rather than an acceptable ambiguity. She had gone to university in Yaoundé, then to Paris for her master's, then into the foreign ministry at 25, with the calm intent of someone who has known for a long time what they are going to do and has been preparing for it methodically. She had served in Brussels first, as a second secretary at the mission to the European Union, 4 years learning the architecture of multilateral negotiation, the way that positions shifted over long cycles of patient process, the value of being the person in the room who had read every document and remembered every prior meeting. She had moved to Geneva for the bilateral trade work, then to Nairobi for the African Union work, then to Washington for this, the bilateral working group with the State Department that the Foreign Ministry had been building toward for 3 years and that had finally moved from framework to formal process 18 months ago. She had represented Cameroon at the General Assembly 3 times. She had negotiated 2 framework agreements. She had sat across from senior officials in 4 countries and had learned, in those 22 years, how to hold a room with the particular authority of someone who is not performing authority, but simply exercising it. The way a skilled practitioner exercises any faculty, naturally, without announcement, as the most efficient way to do the work. She was returning from a 2-day consultation in New York when she arrived at Dulles. She was not returning from abroad. She had been in the country, moving on a State Department-coordinated domestic itinerary with her full diplomatic documentation in the credentials wallet she carried. Her diplomatic passport was unambiguous in its markings. The State Department clearance card in her wallet described, in direct language, the immunities applicable to her person and her effects under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and had a printed number for the State Department's Office of Protocol, available for consultation by any CBP officer, with a question about the applicable framework. It was not a complicated document. It assumed good faith on the part of the reader. Sandra Greer had not been reading in good faith. Sandra was 41 years old, 15 years with CBP, the last 6 at Dulles. She was not an unintelligent officer. Her arrest statistics were solid. Her documentation was reliable. What she had, beneath the surface competence, was a pattern that 3 colleagues had each privately noticed across her time at the airport. A pattern in how she selected passengers for enhanced screening, in which the correlation between the passenger's appearance and the likelihood of selection was too consistent to be explained by random process or legitimate law enforcement basis. The pattern had been noticed. It had never been formally documented, because documenting it required a colleague to make a formal complaint against another colleague, and the friction that created was something none of them had been willing to generate. The 3 words Amara sent her deputy were the thing that changed the cost calculation for everyone. Secondary, Dulles Watch Jean-Claude Fouda was 53 years old, 16 years with the embassy, and one of the most competent people Amara had worked with across a career full of competent people. He had an instinct for which situations required speed and which required patience that had been calibrated across a career of watching both play out to their conclusions. When he received those 3 words at 4:05 p.m., he did not wait to understand the full situation before beginning. He had enough. He made 3 calls in 8 minutes, to the embassy's State Department liaison, to the deputy chief of mission, and to a protocol attorney the embassy retained for exactly this category of situation. By 4:13 p.m., the lawyer had confirmed that the Vienna Convention protections applicable to Amara's status prohibited an enhanced personal search without specific authorization processes that had clearly not been initiated, because the embassy's State Department liaison had checked and found no record of any diplomatic liaison consultation at Dulles in the past hour. Jean-Claude called Dulles at 4:14 p.m. and asked for the customs supervisor. The supervisor was not immediately available. He called back at 4:17 p.m. This time he was put through. The secondary inspection area at Dulles consisted of a waiting area, an inspection room, and an anteroom for officer use. It was designed for customs and immigration review and was equipped for the range of inspections that CBP officers were authorized to conduct. The most extensive of those inspections, an enhanced search of the person, required specific authorization from a supervising officer, documented probable cause, and in the case of a diplomatic passport holder, consultation with the State Department's diplomatic liaison before any search of the person or their effects could lawfully proceed. This was not a technicality. It was a requirement that existed specifically to prevent the kind of situation that was now unfolding. The situation where a country's accredited representative was subjected to a search not sanctioned by law, which constituted not just a procedural violation, but a breach of the diplomatic protections that the United States had formally committed to under international treaty. None of those prerequisites had been initiated or met when Sandra directed Amara into the inspection room and told her the search was going to be comprehensive. Amara said, "I want to be clear about the status of my credentials and the protections applicable to this inspection." Sandra said, "You can be clear all you want. You're in my house." This was the moment that Officers Webb and Reyes would each describe in their independent statements written 2 days later as the moment the situation became something other than a legitimate inspection. They had also heard Sandra's comment before Amara was directed into the room, the one about it being a good one, and both of them had heard it in the register of someone preparing for sport rather than someone exercising lawful authority. Neither of them had intervened, because intervening meant a formal complaint against a senior colleague, and neither of them had reached the point of being willing to do that before the situation clarified itself. What they did was note the time. Independently, both of them looked at the clock at the moment Sandra said it. 4:06 p.m. What they did not know yet, what nobody in that customs area knew, was that Amara Owosu Bempa had sent 3 words to Jean-Claude Fuda at 4:04 p.m., 2 minutes before she was formally directed into secondary inspection. She had sent them from the primary screening area, where she had been asked to wait while the officer consulted Sandra. Let me describe that primary screening moment precisely, because its timeline matters. Amara had arrived at the document review station at 4:02 p.m. The officer there was young and thorough, and had done exactly the right thing. He reviewed her diplomatic passport and her State Department clearance card, recognized that diplomatic credentials at a domestic arrival checkpoint were outside his daily experience, and went to consult a senior officer. This was correct procedure. This was exactly what he should have done. The senior officer he found was Sandra Greer. Sandra had reviewed the credentials for approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds was long enough to read both documents clearly. The diplomatic passport stated Amara's status unambiguously. The State Department clearance card stated the applicable protections directly and included a consultation number for the Office of Protocol for any CBP officer with questions. Sandra had returned the documents, told Amara she had been selected for secondary inspection, and when Amara had asked whether there was a specific documented basis for the selection, had said it was random. When Amara had asked whether the secondary inspection would proceed in accordance with the protocols applicable to her credential level, Sandra had said she would need to check. She had not checked. Amara had watched Sandra walk toward the secondary area and had assessed the situation with the accuracy of someone who has spent 22 years learning to read the direction a room is moving before it fully arrives. She had taken out her phone. She had sent 3 words. She had not been wrong. Jean-Claude had been making calls for 13 minutes by the time Sandra picked up the desk phone at 4:17. Sandra came into the inspection room doorway at 4:19 p.m. She had been in the anteroom for 2 minutes after the phone call ended, and those 2 minutes had done the specific work that 2 minutes do when a person is recalibrating their understanding of a situation they had completely misread from the beginning. Her face had undergone the transition that faces undergo under those circumstances, not a dramatic change, but a flattening. A loss of the ease that had been in it 12 minutes earlier when she had made her comment about the good one. She looked, now, like someone who had taken a step and found the ground in a different place than expected. Amara was sitting in the chair provided for inspected persons. She was seated with the upright composure of someone who has spent 22 years in rooms where composure was a professional requirement, and who had spent the past 13 minutes being very still and very present and very certain about what was happening and what it meant and what was going to happen next. She looked at Sandra. Sandra said, "There's a call for you." Amara said, "Yes, I expect there is." She walked to the anteroom. She picked up the phone. She spoke with Jean-Claude for 90 seconds, confirming the situation and confirming that she was unharmed and confirming that she wished the matter to be handled through official channels. She gave Jean-Claude the name on the officer's badge, Sandra L. Greer, and the time the secondary selection had begun. Jean-Claude said, "The State Department's Office of Protocol has been briefed. There will be someone from the duty officer desk at the airport within the hour." Amara said, "Thank you, Jean-Claude." She handed the phone back to the officer at the desk, not Sandra, who was standing 6 feet away against the wall with the particular stillness of someone who has just fully understood the dimensions of their situation, and asked if she could have her belongings returned. Her belongings were returned. She walked through the anteroom without looking at Sandra Greer. She did, however, look at Officers Webb and Reyes, who were standing at the desk. She said, "I imagine you'll both be asked to provide statements. I hope you'll be accurate." She walked through the sliding doors into the terminal. The State Department's Office of Protocol Duty Officer arrived at Dulles at 5:11 p.m. His name was Michael Torres, and he had been in the position for 9 years. He had handled a small number of diplomatic incidents at ports of entry across those 9 years. Small because such incidents were genuinely rare, because the great majority of CBPEP officers understood the Vienna Convention framework and had no reason to test its limits, and because the consequences of testing those limits were significant enough to deter the handful who might otherwise have been tempted. He had never handled one quite like this. The documented evidence was clear before he finished his first interview with the supervisor on duty. A diplomatic passport holder with full, unambiguous credentials had been directed into secondary inspection without documented basis, subjected to an enhanced personal search without the supervisor authorization, probable cause documentation, or State Department diplomatic liaison consultation required by both federal regulation and the Vienna Convention, and had been addressed during that search in a manner that 2 colleagues had independently documented in statements written within 4 hours of the incident. He met with the supervisor. He met with Officer Greer. He met separately with Officers Webb and Reyes, whose statements were consistent with each other and with the time-stamped records he pulled from the inspection area's access log. He called the CBP Regional Director at 6:02 p.m. He called the State Department's Diplomatic Affairs Director at 6:19 p.m. He drafted his preliminary incident report, which ran to 14 pages, between 7 and 9 p.m. at a desk in the CBP Supervisory Office. The supervisor on duty had placed Sandra Greer on administrative leave at 5:47 p.m., before Torres had finished his meetings. He had done this because the shape of what had happened was clear enough by that point to require action before the shift ended, and because he had understood, from the first 90 seconds of the embassy's call that afternoon, that this was not a situation he could manage by deferring the decision. Sandra left the building at 5:52 p.m. The formal investigation by CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility took 6 weeks and produced a 41-page findings report. Its conclusions were not favorable to Officer Greer. The enhanced search had been conducted without authorization on every required dimension. The 2 colleagues' statements established that no legitimate inspection basis had been articulated before, during, or after the inspection, that the process had been initiated without probable cause, without supervisory authorization, and without the good faith required for any lawful enforcement action. The comment documented in both statements, made before entering the inspection room, characterizing the search as entertainment rather than enforcement, was cited in the report's findings as evidence dispositive of intent. Sandra Greer was terminated 61 days after the incident. The Cameroon Embassy filed a formal diplomatic note with the State Department on behalf of Attach Owusu Bempa. The diplomatic note was a specific formal document, not a complaint, but a communication between governments, entered into the official record of the bilateral relationship. The State Department's response was a formal written apology transmitted through diplomatic channels within 10 days of the incident. The apology acknowledged, specifically and without qualification, the violation of Attach Owusu Bempa's protections under the Vienna Convention, expressed the regret of the United States government, and committed to procedural reforms at the port of entry level to prevent recurrence. The response was received by the Cameroon Foreign Ministry. It was noted. The bilateral relationship continued. The working group continued. The trade framework discussions that Amara had been in Washington to support concluded successfully 8 months after the incident at Dulles, with the communique signed and delivered, and the work done that the work had been meant to do. The incident did not define what happened next. The work defined what happened next. That was how it was supposed to go. Amara Owusu-Bempah did not speak publicly about the incident. This was consistent with her character and with the professional philosophy she had developed across 22 years in a career where the impulse to make a public statement about a personal injustice, however justified, had to be weighed against the institutional relationships that the statement would enter and alter. She had been asked for comment twice by journalists who had obtained the diplomatic note through a Freedom of Information request. She had declined both times, not because her legal counsel advised it, but because she had thought carefully about it and concluded that the incident's meaning was not located in her account of it. The meaning was in the record, the diplomatic note, the State Department apology, the investigation findings, the termination, the protocol reform commitments, said everything that needed to be said, with a specificity and authority that her own public statement would add nothing to. She had, however, said one thing privately, to Jean-Claude when he called to check on her the week after the incident and asked simply how she was. She had been quiet for a moment, the genuine quiet of someone taking stock rather than composing. Then she said, I keep thinking about the word she used. House. She said I was in her house. She paused. I've been in a great many rooms across this career. Negotiating chambers, foreign ministers' offices, the General Assembly, airport inspection rooms on 4 continents. I have never once believed that any of those rooms were mine. They belonged to the institution, to the law, to the purpose they were built to serve. The idea that a room belongs to whoever currently holds authority in it, that's the mistake. It's always been the mistake. The room belongs to the law, and the law was on my side. Jean-Claude said it usually is. She said, not always. But this time, and this time, was enough. She went back to work the following Monday. The working group meeting was on Wednesday. She was prepared. She had always been prepared. In 22 years of diplomacy, across 4 postings in 3 continents, she had learned that the rooms that mattered were not the ones where authority was loudest or most confident or most certain of its own rightness. They were the ones where the work got done. She had spent her career finding those rooms, sitting in them carefully and purposefully, and leaving the other rooms, the ones where someone had confused temporary authority for something it was not, to the systems designed to correct the confusion. The systems had corrected this one in 11 minutes. 11 minutes from 3 words sent at 4:04 p.m. to a phone ringing in an anteroom at 4:17. 11 minutes between the moment Sandra Greer had made her joke and the moment the joke had revealed itself to be the last thing she would say in that building as an employee. Amara had not made the phone ring. She had sent the words and trusted Jean-Claude to do what Jean-Claude did, which was everything that needed doing with the precision and the speed that the situation required. He had. She was 47 years old. She had a working group session on Wednesday, a communique to deliver by Friday, and 22 years of rooms still ahead of her. She was already preparing for Wednesday. She was always preparing for the next room.